If you ever feel like your life is slipping through your fingers, pay attention, because what happened to me could happen to anyone. I met Dr. Alexander Kane during my first year at the university, and at 21, I thought I knew ambition. But ambition, in its raw form, the kind that he had, is intoxicating. He wasn't just a professor, he was a force. Intelligent, magnetic, and impossibly polished. My peers whispered about how careers skyrocketed under his mentorship, how his attention was a mark of inevitable success. I wanted that. I wanted him. At first, it was innocent. Late-night study sessions in his office, lingering conversations about research, and the thrill of someone noticing me in ways nobody else did. He praised me, always just enough to make me believe in my own brilliance. It wasn't flattery, it was precision. I was a chess piece in a game I didn't yet understand. Then came the subtle shifts. A hand on my shoulder that lingered, a text that arrived long after class hours, asking if I was truly living my potential. I convinced myself I was reading too much into it, but when he started inviting me to dinners to discuss my future, I felt an undeniable pull. It was intoxicating. I was 21, unsure, and he was the world I wanted to conquer. The first kiss felt like destiny. It was just us in that office, the city lights spilling through the blinds, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. He told me he admired my courage, my intellect, my fire. He said he wanted to see me rise, that nothing could stop us. I believed him. I believed in us. Months passed, and the mentorship blurred into obsession for me at least. I started prioritizing him, his projects, his guidance, over my own friends and even my family. I thought I was lucky. I thought I was chosen. I never questioned the intensity of his attention or the subtle ways he isolated me from others who might have noticed how controlling he could be. It was only after he handed me my first major opportunity, a paper he promised to co-author, a chance to present at a national conference, that the cracks began to appear. I stayed up nights perfecting every detail, trusting him implicitly, until one morning I discovered an email that froze me in place. He had presented my work as his own in a private meeting with the university board. My name wasn't mentioned once, not a whisper. The man I trusted, the man I loved, had manipulated me professionally and personally. I felt my stomach drop, my world collapse, and worse, no one would believe me. Everyone saw him as untouchable. I was young, naive, and now utterly alone, but in that moment of betrayal, a small, cold fire ignited inside me. He thought he had me crushed, pliant, silenced. He thought he had destroyed me. He had no idea. I decided then that I would survive, and when I did, he would regret ever underestimating me. The first weeks after discovering his betrayal were a fog of humiliation and disbelief. I couldn't look at my own reflection without seeing the foolish girl who had trusted too easily, who had believed a man's charm over her own instincts. Every hallway at the university felt suffocating, every lecture a reminder that I was expendable in his eyes. He smiled at me like nothing had happened, and I pretended to smile back, all while my chest ached with a combination of shame, rage, and heartbreak. I tried to speak up at first. I approached the department head, detailing what had happened with trembling words, clutching printed emails and drafts that proved my work was stolen. But he had a reputation. Dr. Kane's brilliance was untouchable. The head's sympathetic nods did nothing. They all said the same thing. These situations are complicated. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? The word felt like a slap to my face. I was powerless, publicly invisible, yet painfully aware that every eye in the department saw me as the naive student making a fuss. And then came the loneliness. My friends, the few I still trusted, recoiled when I told them the full truth. "Are you sure you're not overreacting?" they asked, with hesitant concern. I realized that no one wanted to confront a man like him. No one wanted to ruin their own reputations by siding with a student. I was utterly isolated. The mentor I had adored, the person I had let into my heart, had weaponized my trust and left me exposed. Sleep became scarce. I replayed every conversation, every dinner, every late-night discussion, trying to find the moment I should have seen the warning. There were red flags, subtle, almost invisible at the time, but I had ignored them because I wanted to believe in the story he told me. The story where we were a team, where I was destined to shine under his guidance. It was a lie, and the pain of realization was electric, sharp enough to make me feel like I would never recover. But within that haze of betrayal, something hardened inside me. The humiliation, the helplessness, they were fuel. I began to think of ways he could be held accountable, ways I could take back the control he had stolen from me. At first, it was just fantasies of confrontation, of exposing him in front of the university. But slowly, methodically, those fantasies grew into plans. I started observing him differently, noting his patterns, his arrogance, his reliance on others to prop up his reputation. I realized his brilliance was not in his intellect, but in the way he manipulated perceptions, his own carefully constructed web of illusions. I made a silent vow that night, sitting alone in my apartment, surrounded by my rejected drafts and stolen work. I would rebuild. Not just my career, not just my reputation, but myself. And when I did, I would turn the very skills he had taught me, the intelligence he had praised, into a weapon. I would make sure that no one, ever again, could take advantage of me the way he had. I wouldn't be the victim in his story. I would write my own, and it would end with him exposed, with him humiliated, and with me finally free. I started paying attention to him in ways I never had before. The way a soldier studies an enemy. Dr. Kane still smiled that same charming, effortless smile, still tossed casual remarks like breadcrumbs to see who would follow. He didn't notice that I was no longer the naive student in his office. I observed every pattern, every carefully constructed interaction, and I cataloged them mentally, like pages in a dossier only I could read. I had submitted another paper, one that I thought was a collaboration, but had been carefully edited by him to emphasize his own contribution. He praised me in front of everyone, yet the way he subtly phrased his sentences took all the credit. My stomach twisted as I realized this wasn't a one-time betrayal. It was a system he had perfected, a cycle he used repeatedly to prop himself up while keeping others in the shadows. It wasn't just professional manipulation either. His charm had seeped into personal relationships. I began noticing the way he spoke to other young students, the way he lingered in conversations, the small gestures that were supposed to be reassuring but were controlling instead. I remembered how he had isolated me from friends, convinced me that they didn't understand my potential. Now, seeing him do the same to others, I realized the pattern. He preyed on ambition, on trust, on desire, and he left chaos in his wake. One late evening, I decided to confront him, but not in the way anyone would expect. I walked into his office, carrying a draft of my next paper, feigning enthusiasm and gratitude. He leaned back in his chair, that familiar smirk on his face, clearly pleased that I had returned, still eager, still malleable. I smiled politely, keeping my expression neutral, and asked a few casual questions about his recent projects, letting my words seem like admiration. I could see the satisfaction in his eyes, and I realized that he still thought he had me completely under his influence. He didn't suspect that I was observing him, cataloging his every word and gesture, noting every inconsistency and every overreach. I let him believe he was in control, because control was what he thrived on, and that control would be the very thing I would turn against him. After that night, I began systematically documenting everything: emails, meeting notes, casual conversations, discrepancies in his professional claims. All of it went into a private file on a secure drive. Every encounter became a test. How far would he push? How easily could he manipulate? And more importantly, how much evidence could I quietly gather without him noticing? It was a dangerous game, and I had to be careful. One wrong move, one misstep, and he could ruin me completely. But every day I played along, every compliment I feigned, every late-night discussion I endured, the fire in me grew stronger. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing, learning, and building a strategy that he could never anticipate. The first real taste of power came quietly, a simple, small action that let me feel his arrogance crack just a little. A reminder that even the most meticulous manipulator can slip, and that slip, small as it was, told me that he was human, and that humans can be undone. I knew I couldn't confront him openly yet. That would be reckless. Instead, I started with small, calculated maneuvers, tiny nudges that would unsettle him without revealing my intentions. The first was professional, almost imperceptible. I carefully inserted subtle corrections into shared drafts, so that errors he might have tried to pass off as his own would instead reflect poorly on him if anyone looked closely. I didn't announce it. I didn't gloat. I watched him, pretending ignorance, as he casually overlooked these details, completely unaware that the groundwork for his undoing was already being laid. It was thrilling in a way I hadn't expected. I had been consumed by shame, humiliation, and heartbreak for months. But now I felt a different kind of power, quiet, controlled, deliberate. Every interaction with him became a game of patience and precision. I listened more, spoke less, and cataloged everything. Who trusted him blindly? Who depended on him? Where were his vulnerabilities? Slowly, I began to understand that his brilliance wasn't just in his intellect, it was in the illusion of perfection he projected. And illusions can always be shattered. The first real emotional test came when he invited me to one of his private dinners, under the guise of discussing my career. The memory of our past closeness, the late nights, the whispered promises. The intimacy was still a raw ache in my chest, but I forced myself to separate emotion from strategy. I smiled, laughed at his jokes, and engaged in casual conversation while mentally noting every interaction, every favor he requested, every person present who might later corroborate his patterns. At one point, he leaned closer, brushing a hand against mine as if nothing had changed, and whispered, "You're smarter than anyone gives you credit for. You'll go far." I wanted to recoil, to slap him, to scream. Instead, I leaned in slightly, letting the gesture pass, all while mentally cataloging how often he relied on charm to manipulate. That dinner was a test, not for me, but for him, and he passed in arrogance, completely unaware that I was rewriting the rules of our relationship in my head. Afterward, I returned to my apartment, where my notes and evidence were spread across the desk like a battle map. Each email, each conversation, each subtle manipulation became a puzzle piece. Slowly, a picture emerged. A network of lies, half-truths, and carefully staged accomplishments. He had fooled everyone, but I was beginning to see the cracks. The arrogance that had once intimidated me was now my ally. His overconfidence would be his downfall. I didn't yet know exactly how I would strike, but the fire inside me was now uncontainable. I would need patience, cunning, and the willingness to let him walk right into the trap. For now, the game was in motion, and I was no longer the girl crushed by betrayal. I was the strategist, the observer, the one silently orchestrating a reckoning. And somewhere deep down, beneath the careful calculation, I allowed myself a small, forbidden thought. The man who had taken everything from me was no longer untouchable. The first tangible step had to be subtle but undeniable. I knew I needed proof that couldn't be dismissed as a misunderstanding or coincidence. It wasn't enough to rely on memory or vague suspicions. I needed documents, emails, and records that painted a clear picture of his deceit. Every conversation, every draft, every gesture became a potential breadcrumb leading to the truth. I started by revisiting old submissions and emails, piecing together timelines and cross-referencing them with public records and conference schedules. It was tedious work, hours spent at a small desk, laptop glowing late into the night, but each discovery felt like a small victory. I found discrepancies I hadn't noticed before, papers he claimed sole authorship of, letters of recommendation he had manipulated, invitations to speak at events he had secured by subtly taking credit for my efforts. The most satisfying discovery, however, was a chain of emails between him and a colleague that revealed the full extent of his manipulation. He had not only taken credit for my work, but had actively undermined me in private discussions, ensuring no one else would recognize my contributions. My heart raced as I saved each message, each timestamp, knowing that this was the kind of evidence that could destroy him, not just professionally, but publicly, if necessary. At the same time, I had to maintain the illusion of the obedient, grateful protege. He still treated me with the same patronizing charm, unaware that every interaction was being mentally cataloged, analyzed, and stored for later use. I laughed when he told me I had a promising future, and nodded at his advice, all while knowing that his very words could one day be used against him. The psychological toll was enormous. I was constantly balancing fear, anger, and the adrenaline rush of secret preparation. I replayed our shared moments in my mind, alternating between remembering the warmth I once felt and dissecting the manipulations he had used to gain my trust. Sleep came in fits, dreams were haunted by his smirk, and yet, amidst the exhaustion, a strange clarity emerged. I knew what I had to do, and for the first time in months, I felt a measure of control. Then came a complication I hadn't anticipated. One of his other protégés, a bright but impressionable student, began confiding in me. They spoke of their own frustrations, their suspicions about him, their desire to succeed without being overshadowed. I realized that I wasn't alone in my struggle. There were others caught in the same web of manipulation. Their trust in me was tentative, but it presented an opportunity. Not just for corroboration, but for understanding how deep his deceit ran and who else could become an ally or an unwitting pawn. By the end of that week, I had a secure folder of evidence, a list of witnesses, and a clear picture of his vulnerabilities. Each piece brought me closer to the inevitable confrontation. But I knew one thing: timing was everything. One false move, one premature accusation, and he could destroy me completely. Patience had become my weapon, and I wielded it with meticulous precision. The fire inside me had grown cold and sharp. He had thought he had broken me. Now, unknowingly, he had walked straight into my trap. I decided it was time to test him. To see just how far his arrogance would take him and how careless he truly was. I started small, a few carefully placed remarks in meetings, compliments that hinted at my growing independence, questions that subtly highlighted my knowledge and initiative. I watched him respond, studied his reactions, and noted every flicker of unease that crossed his otherwise confident demeanor. It was intoxicating to realize how much control I had over the narrative now. He had thrived for years on perception, and I was slowly dismantling that perception piece by piece. I let him underestimate me, allowed him to believe that I was still dependent, still grateful, still pliant. All the while I was cataloging his insecurities, how he reacted when someone challenged his ideas, how he subtly pushed certain protégés against others, and how much he relied on charm to obscure his failings. Then came an opportunity I hadn't expected. During a private conference call, he casually discussed a project he was planning to present as a joint effort. He casually revealed details about sources he had no right to claim and hinted at manipulating data to ensure his prominence. I kept my voice neutral when I responded, asking clarifying questions, noting every slip. When the call ended, I quietly saved a recording of the session, my heart hammering in excitement. This wasn't just proof. It was a glimpse into the extent of his recklessness and the arrogance that would be his undoing. The emotional side of this game was harder to manage. Every interaction brought back flashes of what I had once felt for him, the admiration, the thrill, the moments that had felt like love. I had to steel myself against nostalgia, against the seductive memory of his attention, because indulging in it would blur the line between strategy and obsession. My anger, my desire for justice, had to remain sharp, untarnished by sentiment. I also began subtly gathering allies. The student who had confided in me earlier became more willing to share observations. Once I proved I understood the dynamics at play. Together, we started to trace his manipulations, noting patterns in his mentorship, documenting who had been undermined, and where his overconfidence left gaps. The work was quiet, painstaking, but I could feel the momentum building. By the time another faculty dinner arrived, I was ready to test the limits of his arrogance. I let him believe I was still completely under his influence, praising his ideas, deferring to his judgment, smiling at his charming remarks. But when a subtle mistake appeared in his presentation, one he hadn't noticed, I made sure to react with polite curiosity, asking questions that gently exposed the error to the few attentive colleagues in the room. His composure cracked for the briefest moment, and I felt a thrill at that tiny victory. That night, alone in my apartment, I allowed myself a quiet smile. The plan was no longer just a fantasy. Every step I had taken, every observation, every recorded detail, had brought me closer to the moment where he would face consequences, and I finally realized the truth of my own strength. He had underestimated me, and he had done so because he had assumed I was like the others he controlled. But I wasn't. I never had been. It happened sooner than I expected. Dr. Kane, usually so confident and untouchable, began showing the first subtle signs of suspicion. I noticed it in the way he studied me more closely during meetings, in the fleeting tension when I asked clarifying questions, in the way his tone shifted ever so slightly when I offered input. It was faint, almost imperceptible. But I could feel it like static in the air, a warning that my careful dance was being noticed. The first incident occurred during a department seminar. I had been scheduled to present a minor paper, one I had meticulously prepared, partly as a test to gauge his reactions, and partly to assert a quiet presence in front of other faculty. As I spoke, he leaned back in his chair, nodding, but his eyes were calculating, sharp. Afterward, he cornered me outside the lecture hall, his voice low and smooth. "I've noticed your recent initiatives. Ambitious of you." There was an edge to the compliment, a subtle accusation hidden behind the words. I smiled, keeping my expression neutral. "I just want to contribute meaningfully," I replied, careful not to let any hint of triumph or defiance slip. He studied me for a long moment, his gaze flicking to my notes, to my laptop bag, then back to me. I felt the tension, the realization that my small victories were starting to register. Yet, even as he scrutinized me, I remained in control. I let him think he might be seeing cracks in my compliance, all while mentally noting his reaction for future use. At the same time, he began changing his tactics. Casual mentorship conversations became more guarded, emails were more formal, and his charm toward me, once effortless, now felt strained, calculated. I understood immediately. He had sensed a shift, even if he couldn't yet define it, and that was perfect. His fear of losing control was now a tool I could exploit, a vulnerability hidden beneath layers of arrogance. But the closer I observed him, the more I realized how much danger I was in. One misstep, one poorly timed remark, and he could turn all the tables, ruin my credibility, or even sabotage my career before I was ready to strike. The stakes had risen. Every meeting, every email, every dinner, every casual encounter became a careful performance, a delicate balance between showing just enough deference to keep him unsuspecting, and asserting just enough competence to maintain momentum. And yet, even under pressure, I could feel my resolve solidifying. The betrayal that had once left me raw and broken had been transformed into something else, a precise, patient strategy. I was no longer merely surviving. I was building a web, thread by thread, and he was unknowingly walking right into it. Late that night, I reviewed the growing dossier of evidence, emails, recordings, and observations. The picture was clear now, not just of his deceit, but of his patterns, his overconfidence, his blind spots. I could see exactly how, when, and where I could strike. It wouldn't be impulsive, it wouldn't be messy, it would be perfect, and somewhere deep down, I allowed myself a brief, quiet satisfaction. The man who had once made me feel powerless was now nervous, uncertain, and vulnerable. The hunter had become the observed, and the moment of reckoning was drawing closer. The first real setback came when I let my emotions get the better of me, a mistake I had sworn I would never make. I was reviewing my notes late one night, replaying conversations in my head, when I found myself drafting a carefully worded email intended to subtly expose one of his minor manipulations to a colleague. My fingers hovered over the send button, heart racing, thinking about the satisfaction of finally watching him squirm. And then I hesitated. A flash of fear and doubt struck me. What if I had misread something? What if I pushed too hard, too fast? The email went unsent. But in that moment, I realized how emotionally fragile I still was. Anger and desire for revenge could cloud judgment, and even a single lapse could ruin everything I had worked for. I had to be smarter, I had to be colder. The next morning, I noticed subtle changes in his behavior that unnerved me. He was more guarded than ever, yes, but also sharper. almost anticipatory in his questions. He asked about projects I wasn't even directly involved in, referenced meetings I hadn't attended, and generally seemed alert. It was as if he had sensed a shift but couldn't pinpoint its source. I felt a prick of fear. He was dangerous in ways I had underestimated. Then came the personal blow. I discovered that he had started confiding in a colleague about my recent ambitions, framing me as unpredictable, maybe even untrustworthy. It was subtle gossip, the kind that could erode my credibility slowly but effectively. I realized that the same charm he had wielded to manipulate me could now be used to preempt my moves. I was no longer invisible. I was on his radar. The emotional weight of that realization hit me hard. I felt the familiar sting of isolation, the same helplessness that had overwhelmed me months ago. It was a cruel reminder that even the best laid plans could falter. For the first time, I questioned my ability to see this through without exposing myself, without giving him ammunition to destroy me entirely. But amidst the fear, a renewed clarity emerged. This setback didn't mean failure. It meant recalibration. I couldn't let my anger dictate my actions. Every move had to be deliberate, measured, and precise. I had to anticipate his moves, not react to them. I reminded myself that patience was my greatest weapon. That night, I sat with my dossier of evidence, reviewing everything I had collected, noting patterns, vulnerabilities, and inconsistencies. I mapped out potential outcomes for every action he might take. I had underestimated him, yes, but only temporarily. From now on, I would play an even more careful game, learning from my misstep rather than letting it define me. And in that quiet, lonely moment, I felt a spark of determination ignite anew. I had been humiliated, manipulated, and nearly undone, but I was still standing. And soon he would see just how unstoppable I could be when fueled by betrayal and sharpened by strategy. I realized that if I wanted to ensure his downfall, I couldn't rely solely on my own observations. He had built a web of influence and loyalty around him. People who would instinctively defend him, dismiss my claims, or even undermine me if I misstepped. I needed witnesses, corroboration, and allies who could see him the way I did. I started quietly reaching out to former students, those who had once been under his mentorship but had since moved on. I approached them cautiously, never revealing too much at once, testing their willingness to speak openly. At first, the responses were tentative. Some were reluctant, fearful of repercussions, still dazzled by his charm despite the harm they had experienced. But as I shared small, verifiable details, dates, projects, subtle manipulations, I could see recognition flicker in their eyes. They weren't imagining things, they had been deceived too. The first ally I secured was a quiet doctoral student named Claire. She had once been one of his most promising protégés, but had quietly faded into the background after repeated professional setbacks. When I reached out, her initial skepticism melted after a single conversation. She had her own notes, her own observations, and a deep understanding of his methods. Together, we began to compile a chronological record of his manipulations, a timeline that connected professional sabotage to personal charm and deceit. The process was painstaking. Every email had to be cross-referenced, every meeting note verified, every anecdote corroborated. There was always the risk of error. One mistake could destroy credibility and give him the opportunity to strike first. But as we worked, I began to feel a surge of power. For the first time since the betrayal, I was no longer alone, and I realized that the combined weight of our evidence could be unstoppable if wielded correctly. Meanwhile, I continued my interactions with Dr. Kane, pretending to be the compliant student while subtly testing him. I asked questions in meetings, offered input that appeared naive but was actually strategic, and let him continue underestimating me. Each time he responded with overconfidence or subtle manipulation, I made a mental note. The more he exposed, the stronger my position became. There were moments when the emotional toll was nearly unbearable. I hated seeing the ease with which he continued to charm others, the way he smiled and laughed, unburdened by guilt. I hated remembering how easily I had been ensnared, but those memories also sharpened my resolve. Every slight, every betrayal, every condescending word fueled the precision of the plan I was building. By the end of the month, our dossier had grown massive, dozens of corroborated emails, detailed notes, witness statements, and records of manipulated projects. I finally had something tangible, a foundation strong enough to challenge him publicly, professionally, and irrevocably. And as I looked at the files, meticulously organized and labeled, I allowed myself a quiet, private thought. The man who had thought himself untouchable was walking blindly into the storm I was about to unleash. Just as I began to feel that my plan was solid, an unexpected complication arose. One afternoon, I received a terse email from the department chair, a mandatory meeting with Dr. Kane included. No explanation, no context, just an order to appear. My heart sank. Something had shifted. He must have sensed that the balance of power was slipping. And now he was moving. At the meeting, the tension was palpable. Dr. Kane smiled as usual, but there was a subtle edge, a barely contained wariness in his eyes. He began speaking about recent projects, praising students selectively, and watching my reactions with the precision of a hawk. Every word he said, every gesture he made, felt calculated, to remind me and everyone else present that he still controlled the narrative. It was during this meeting that I realized the depth of his influence. A senior faculty member, one I had hoped might be an ally, subtly questioned my recent initiatives. In front of the group, framing them as overly ambitious or premature. Dr. Kane didn't need to speak. His presence alone carried weight. The unspoken message was clear: overreach, and you will be disciplined, marginalized, or discredited. I left the meeting with a mix of fear and exhilaration. The stakes had escalated. He was no longer merely a manipulator of my career. He was actively trying to intimidate me, to regain control, to expose me before I could act. And yet, even in that moment, I felt a rush of determination. Every move he made, every attempt to undermine me, provided more information, more evidence, more angles to exploit. That night, I reviewed the dossier again, adding careful notes about the meeting, the senior faculty's reactions, Dr. Kane's subtle gestures, the timing of his interventions. I realized that this interference, rather than a setback, could actually strengthen my case. I just had to adapt, be even more precise, even more patient, and anticipate his attempts to maintain control. I also realized that my emotional resilience would be tested more than ever. The intimidation, the subtle threats, the condescending smiles, they were designed to unnerve me. But I had spent months transforming pain and humiliation into strategy. I couldn't allow fear to dictate my actions. I had to remain calm, measured, and above all, undetectable in my intentions. By the time I went to bed, I had restructured my plan. I would continue gathering evidence, but now I would also document his attempts to manipulate others, to undermine me publicly. These moments would serve as the final nails in the coffin when the time came. Patience, precision, and psychological leverage had to guide every step. And deep inside, a quiet, almost guilty thrill emerged. The mentor who had once seemed invincible was showing cracks. He was tense, cautious, and for the first time, uncertain. And I was ready to use that uncertainty against him. I decided the reckoning had to be public enough to be undeniable, but private enough that he couldn't gaslight it away. It had to be a trap built from the very things he loved: prestige, audience, the illusion of control, and I would turn them into evidence that even his champions couldn't ignore. For weeks I sketched possibilities, each more elaborate than the last, until a clear plan emerged, a staged symposium where he would present, surrounded by his peers, with our allies quietly ready to corroborate everything I'd collected. Pulling it off meant choreography. Claire handled witness prep. She'd practice her account, memorize dates, and steel herself against the inevitable flinch when she saw his face. Another former student agreed to read a portion of a sabotaged draft aloud if called upon. A junior faculty member I'd quietly won over would file an official inquiry the morning after the event if the evidence was strong. I took responsibility for the physical proof. Timestamps, emails, the recorded call where he discussed manipulating data, cross-referenced and clearly annotated. Everything was placed in a locked folder and duplicated in a secure cloud drive, Claire controlled. There would be no single point of failure. Emotionally, the plan felt like walking a razor's edge. I had to perform the part of the grateful protégé with complete conviction. Smile, laugh at his jokes, defer in meetings, while knowing that within days I'd be the instrument of his fall. Some nights I lay awake, thinking about the man he had been before he became what he was. Brilliant, imperfect, the one who first taught me to believe in my voice. Part of me recoiled at the cruelty of destroying someone I'd loved, but another part, the part that remembered being erased. Watching my work disappear into his name, needed justice in a way that apologies couldn't patch. That moral conflict sharpened the plan. I refused to rely on humiliation as entertainment. I wanted accountability, not vengeance for vengeance's sake. So I scripted the symposium to focus on facts, not theatrics. Witnesses would present documented patterns of misattribution, not accusations of character. The goal was reputational and institutional consequences, retraction of stolen publications, a formal review of authorship practices, and structural changes that would prevent him from preying on other ambitious students. If I was going to dismantle him, I would do it in a way that left behind safeguards for the next person. The day of the symposium arrived with an apparition of normalcy, the kind that made my stomach flip. Dr. Kane greeted attendees like always, his charm glossing over whatever private suspicions flickered. In the faculty room, I introduced a segment on collaborative ethics that subtly reframed conversations he'd dominated for years. Then watched him. He shifted in his seat when Claire stood to speak. I felt my pulse climb and settled it with a practiced calm. When the recorded call played, his face drained of color in a way that would later be analyzed and discussed. But in that moment, I only noticed the small human reaction, surprise, then a mask of indignation. There was a moment during Claire's testimony when I almost faltered, when a memory of his hand on my shoulder in a lighter time tightened my throat. I pressed my palm to my own knee, under the table, and breathed, anchoring myself. The room listened, facts spoke, the carefully organized dossier did the rest. I saw colleagues exchange looks, the kind of looks that quietly rewrite alliances. Afterwards, as people murmured and papers were shuffled, I felt something I hadn't expected. The heavy, complicated relief of someone who'd finally named the wrong and put it on record. It wasn't victory yet, far from it, but it was the hinge. The rest of the fall would be procedural, slow and merciless in its bureaucratic way. I had set the trap. He'd stepped in. Now the institution would do what institutions do: investigate, deliberate, and, if the evidence held, act. And under the relief, a smaller, quieter fear remained. The person I would be after all of this. Would I recognize her? Would the lines between justice and retribution blur? I folded those questions away and let the dossier speak for me. Because for the first time in a long time, I trusted my voice to do what my heart alone never could: